Hello and welcome to this week's World Space Week talk on Earth observation and Earth observation satellites. My name is Rachel Venn, and what I'm going to talk to you today is something a little bit different from the other talks on science and technology. I'm going to introduce to you the Earth observation satellites that are taking pictures of the Earth all of the time, 24/7. We're being watched from 800 kilometers and from 36,000 kilometers at different levels of orbit. We're going to introduce what satellites are taking those pictures, what governments are watching, what companies are watching, what they're looking for, and what do we need to think about from a kind of social and societal perspective of these companies that are watching. Are there privacy concerns? Are there international laws that have to be followed? If you think of a government being able to see the military bases of another country, are there any laws about that kind of thing? That's the kind of angle I want to talk to you about today in this instalment of the World Space Week. Now, the field of Earth observation is mainly used for weather and disaster tracking. So immediately you might think of clouds and you might think of water currents and the kinds of things that you can see most obviously on pictures such as this one. But a recent example of one of the ways that Earth observation has been useful is for tracking locusts in Africa. Over this year, you may have noticed that one of the many disasters of 2020 were a series of locust plagues in Africa. For the greatest one in 70 years, particularly in Kenya, what we saw were thousands and thousands of locusts descending on East African countries coming over from Yemen. And what they do is they consume so much food. They will eat their own body weight 10 times over. And when you have billions of locusts, you see entire food supplies getting eradicated in particularly vulnerable communities. And what you can do is you can use Earth observation satellites to track these plagues. They call it forecasting. So the locusts will follow the wind. The locusts will look for areas that are moist and have a lot of moisture in them so that they can lay their eggs and reproduce and keep the locust plague going. And by tracking environmental data, tracking the areas where water is settling in the countries, tracking where the wind is most likely to go next, tracking the areas of vegetation that are most desirable for these insects. What you can do with Earth observation satellites is you can predict where the locusts are going to go and spray them with pesticides before they move on. This is an example of how Earth observation satellites make a tangible difference to life on Earth, and you can't separate the satellites from the people. A lot of fields in space and technology can be rather aspirational and abstract. The idea of going to Mars for the sense of discovery, or looking at the stars out of a sense of wonder. But the thing that makes Earth observation very interesting in the space industry is this human interface. The fact that putting these satellites into orbit will directly affect and benefit the lives of people on Earth. A bit about me. So my name is Rachel Venn. I'm a third-year student at the University of Birmingham. I'm studying physics and astrophysics. It's a little bit different from the angle of this talk, but instead of space, I have some experience in international relations as well. Over the summer, I was working at Europe's Weather Satellite Agency, particularly with the focus on Africa and Earth observation to benefit vulnerable communities. I'm also the treasurer for Astrosoc, so I'm a member of the committee, and I hope that we can get involved with more projects with you over the course of this year, such as the World Space Week at the moment. Let's start off by talking about how we watch the Earth. What satellites are actually up there, and what are they doing to have a look at us? It seems obvious almost, but a lot of the satellites genuinely just have cameras on them, these massive cameras in giant resolutions, and they'll sit down and they will have a look. And satellite will move about in orbit if it's in low Earth orbit, and it will be constantly taking these photos and sending them down. So, for example, the European satellites will send photos of the images for about every 15 minutes. You can get an update. You can have it in different resolutions as well. At the moment, we can get down to about 5 meters for the absolute best ones. 20 years ago, we'd get to 50 meters. It's getting exponentially better and better. And if you want closer images, Google Maps, for example, doesn't take all of its satellite images from satellites. Actually, Google Maps will send out planes with cameras on the bottom of the planes and for cities with buildings and a lot of small angular detail. They'll actually take the photos from the sky rather than from space. Also, weather data is taken on a lot of planes, so temperature, pressure readings, monitoring the air and so on. There are some articles going out at the start of the coronavirus crisis when the planes were grounded. They were having less access to weather data because of the planes. But the vast majority of this stuff comes from space. But it's not just pictures. Another thing that satellites will detect is they will take radio sensing technology, remote sensing technology. So they might image the Earth with radio. They might look up there in other wavelengths, in infrared, and they've got many things to track. They've got to track the clouds, they've got to track the oceans, they've got to track their products as well. So satellite agencies, particularly places like EUMETSAT, the European Weather Satellite Agency, will take this information, combine it into packages. ESA provides the European medium wave weather forecast, which you can get data for how much vegetation is changing, or how much moisture is there over this part of the country, and so on. So actually, a lot of these satellite products will not be pictures in the end, but you can download data sets of all sorts of things that have already been automatically tracked for you. And there's different types of orbit as well. So there's 2 types of weather satellite and observation satellite, depending how far you are above the Earth. If you're closer to the Earth, you're seeing things in high resolution, but you're not seeing a lot of it. And then you can also be very far away from the Earth in a geostationary orbit. Who is watching? At the start, when space industry was first established, the only actors in space were countries and satellite agencies. So the only people who could afford to put anything in orbit were the USA with NASA, eventually the European Space Agency with ENVISAT, the environmental satellites. And you have other countries getting involved. You have Japan, Russia, China, India, South Korea, Canada. France does some things independently from the European Union. And in terms of the European Union, Brexit means that the UK will still be involved with weather satellites and with satellite imagery. That's one of the deals they've done quietly, because it's like our involvement with the European Space Agency is independent of the European Union now. So that's just more of a continental thing. So we will stay involved in that. But now, just like we've seen with going up to the space station, and we've seen it with telecommunications, it's becoming more and more possible for private companies, for very rich people, and for very rich companies to put their own satellites into orbit. What once was the domain only of the international sphere, only of countries, can now also be the domain of the individual. So before, the only satellites in orbit would have been constricted and subject to international cooperation and policy. But now that you'll have satellites such as GeoEye, they provide the images for Google Earth, and they're not subject to any kind of, they're within a country, but they are not subject to the same laws as the USA would be if it were acting as a country. There's other private satellites too. Most recently, we've heard of Elon Musk's ambitions to have Starlink, which is 30,000 or so satellites for telecommunications. But we've got private Earth observation satellites as well, and we'll see a bit about one of those examples later on. Here's some examples of Earth observation satellites. So on the left, we have ENVISAT, which is ESA. ENVISAT is out of action now. It was from 2002 to 2012 when it stopped working, unfortunately. And when it was in its peak, it was the largest Earth observation satellite in the world, or well, above the world. What it did was it tracked the weather, it tracked the environment, most importantly. So it would be looking for vegetation, it would be looking at the ozone layer, It was looking at the ocean, at humidity, and agriculture is a very important field for these Earth observation satellites, particularly in communities where the weather changes a lot of the time, or the weather changes rarely, but in very extreme ways. It can be crucial for growing food, for animals, to know exactly what is going to happen and when to plant your crops. This is one of the ways that environmental and agricultural modelling is useful to people, and ENVISAT was one of the open source satellites that did that. It had a mass of over 8,000 kilograms when it went into orbit, and it's in low Earth orbit that goes over the poles, which means it will go all around the planet eventually. We'll see a picture of this soon, and it can see things quite close up, but it doesn't get a wide angular view. So actually, you're only going to see this field in particular on quite a slow rotation, because the satellite has to go around and look at other things before it gets back to it. That's an advantage of a geostationary satellite. They can watch the thing you want it to see all of the time. So Meteosat, which is one of EUMETSAT's satellites, is an example of a geostationary satellite. The Meteosats are still in orbit, so we have, they come in generations. The first ones were in the 1995, the first generation. They come in groups of 6. And then we had when was it? I haven't written that down. Then we had around the mid-2000s, the second generation. And the third generation is going to be starting to come out from next year. They replace them every now and then. They're quite a bit smaller. And the Meteosats are tracking weather from a much further distance away. What they do is, being in geostationary orbit means that they have to be positioned permanently over different parts of the Earth, and they'll continue to see it. That's at 36,000 kilometers, and they can observe about a third of the Earth at the time. So being a European satellite, they're not observing the entire disk, but they've got one over the Indian Ocean. They've got one at 3.5 degrees east, one at 0 degrees east, one at 9.5, one at 41.5 degrees. And these will capture a lot of the image and allow you to continually see this rather than waiting for the satellite to get about. Meteosat data comes through about every 15 minutes. Now, a bit more information on these orbits. So in low Earth orbit, you've got to be about 800 kilometers above the Earth. This is flexible. So you can't get too low, because then the atmosphere drags too much and your satellite is always starting to fall out of where you want it to be. When you do that, you have to use the boosters and get the satellite back into position, and that becomes expensive. There's only so much fuel to use, and you can't really keep track of where it is. So it's got to be above about 600 or 700. And then the upper bound is 1/3 of the radius of the Earth. And in this band, we call it low Earth orbit. We have most of the Earth observation satellites. We have every manned space mission ever has been in this thing. The ISS is in low Earth orbit. There's a lot of space junk in low Earth orbit, because this is where the majority of satellites have been. You've got a small field of view. You can't see very far. You can see in this example in the bottom left, this is a NASA Earth observation satellite, and you can see, they can see, I mean, it's quite a bit. It's more than I can see. They're still above the Earth, but they have to move around to capture a full disk image of the Earth. Often they will go over the poles. This is called a polar orbit. An example of that is the METOP, Meteorological Polar Orbiting Satellites. They're another one that Europe has. And in order to not just be stuck seeing things over the poles, they will move a few degrees on every rotation and then see the most of the Earth like that. There will be dark spots, but in a sun-synchronous orbit, you do it in the follow around at the same time as that part of the Earth is lit up by the sun. And it's very precise. You have to change degrees at the exact right amount, but that's the way that we have images like this that don't have part of the planet in nighttime, because then you can't see anything. The alternative orbit for Earth observation satellites is geostationary orbit. In between these two is something called mid-orbit, which is where GPS and stuff is, but you don't have any imaging at that orbit, because you have all of the, you don't get the advantages of being geostationary. So it's like a low Earth orbit, but just further away, so you can't see as much. That's the reason we stick to these two. In geostationary orbit, as we all probably know, you get to see the exact same thing constantly, all of the time. Due to physics and just the general classical mechanics of it, which is quite simple to work out, you can tell exactly what height it has to be at, and it's irregardless of the mass of the satellite. It has to be exactly, we call it 36,000 kilometers on the surface, more like 35,000. But in this, it's like a ring. You have one orbit, which is geostationary. You can't go a bit above it or a bit below it, or you start to lose your position. The main thing this is used for is big scale weather forecasting. So when you're looking at things overall, you don't need the tiny details. You're never going to see a farmer's field from this orbit. And actually, in terms of perspective, you're very, very far away. But what you can see is the clouds on the scale of countries as they move across the ocean. You can see the way the water vapor is going, and you can see the wind as it moves about the Earth. These are very important for meteorological services, but not so useful for much else. For short-term and real-term forecasting, you can't really do it live, and you can't really do it for really long term, but you can use it to see what is there right now. Now, this is a very useful image I found in my research for this. It's actually from Wikipedia, so you can find it if you dig deep enough. I've got the credit at the bottom, and this is the perspective, a sense of scale for how far away these things actually are. So you can see closest to the Earth, you've got the low Earth orbit zone, and you've got so many subdivisions there because you've got a lot of space to work with. Everything is very cramped together down there. Lots of space debris in that area. And you can see some of the low Earth orbits are basically grazing the surface of the Earth, getting right down to the level of the atmosphere. And at that point, it gets a bit vague. Are you flying? Are you in orbit? It gets a bit muddy down there. You've got the medium Earth orbit zone, which is useless to most things except for GPS. And then right all the way at the top, you see where the moon is? Past the moon, you've got geosynchronous orbits, which you're not going to get much resolution over there. But still, those are in demand because you can only have, you've got to have the orbits a certain space apart from each other, because satellites communicate with the Earth by certain radio frequencies. And if you have them jammed together like this, the orbit, then their signals to the Earth are going to interfere with each other, and nobody wants that. So you have to have them a certain distance apart. And then when you're this distance from the Earth, you can only have, so this one is over this bit, so another satellite can't be. There's a lot of competition for slots in the geostationary orbit. So why it's not as crowded as the low Earth orbit, a lot of international cooperation has to go into who has access to which slots, who gets it. Talk about that a bit later. We're going to see some images from satellites, some examples of what they can see and what resolutions. This is a useful website I like. It's called windy.com. Public source, you just go on the website and you can see live satellite images of what the Earth looks like right now. Now, I can't see in that much resolution. I can't go and I can't look and see if someone's car is parked outside of someone's house or if there's a queue outside Tesco's right now. It's not useful in that kind of resolution. You get to a certain level and then it switches to kind of stock image of Google Street View and so on. But from above, you can see at the bottom, it says 0 minutes ago, when I took this screenshot, this was exactly how all the clouds looked in Europe at the time. I mean, it's fantastic. If you're sitting there, you can see, oh, no chance of heavy clouds near. There's not any in the area. The amount of scale it gives you, and then it gives you the options to check the radar, and it will give you the other products, such as if there's lightning going on, that kind of thing. But this is an example of publicly available live satellite information, and it's a public source. So this image probably comes from EUMETSAT, from one of the meteosats, and close by, not the meteosats, the METOPS, or close by satellite that's viewing it, and it's open source. It's not, they're not paying for this, or if they are, they don't own the satellites. And this is a benefit, because this means that we can all use it. Another image from satellites we'll all be familiar with is when you go onto the satellite section of Google Street View or Apple Maps, if that suits you. And these are updated every 3 years or so. So they're not that fresh. And Google doesn't actually own its own satellites. What Google does is it partners up with private satellite companies and buys their data. And then these become their rights to use exclusively. And Google can go in a lot of resolution. Google can go down to meters. When this first came out, there were a lot of complaints. People were saying, does it invade my privacy if my neighbor can see what's behind my garden wall from above? And at the time, the lawsuits and the laws and the agreements determined that that wasn't an invasion of your privacy, but it definitely, this encroachment of Earth observation changed our relationship with the world around us. 100 years ago, very few people had ever flown. They had hot air balloons in the 1800s, and that was it. Very few people had ever seen the Earth from above. And then now today, you can get this information instantly. You can see any town on the country, any town, any country, any place in the world. You can see someone's back garden in Kazakhstan right now if you wish to, and you can see into your neighbor's garden, into their land. And there's things to think about there. There's things to think about privacy, and there's things to think about the perspective we have. But Google doesn't just take pictures from above. What it also does is if you press Command or Control and drag the mouse, or if you go into Google Earth, there are various ways. If you click the 3D button, you can see Google modeling things in 3D. And this is basically coming from the satellite data. It's using extensive algorithms, and it's seeing where the shadows lie, and it's plotting out 3D versions of these buildings based on the images it's taken from above. So now, and you can click this, you can drag it about, you can change the angles, and now we see that the Earth observation data isn't just a flat bird's eye view. Now it becomes 3-dimensional. Now anyone can see a model of your house. What are the privacy concerns of that? And then we get down to military use of satellites, which is often not mentioned because they don't want us to think about it too heavily, but it's probably one of the main uses of Earth observation satellites out there, each country having a look into each other's back gardens, and not on Google Maps. These can get down, we don't know exactly how detailed they can get down to, but they can get down to a lot of resolution. And these won't be updating every 3 years like Google. These will be updating every day. They can see if new things are built, if the planes move, if the cars move. We see examples of this being used like in Iran in the start of the year, when we thought that was the most dramatic thing that would happen in 2020. And there are privacy concerns. So not only do we have open source things like Windy now, but we have images of ourselves being sold for profit. There's an example that not many people know about of a company doing this called Planet. Planet is quite new. It started around 2010. People came out from NASA to start it. People came out from Google Maps. They're based in the US. And what Planet does is it takes an image of the entire Earth every day, and it will take it down to a resolution of 3.5 meters, or 5 meters, or 10 meters, depending on what your purchase plan is or what you need. But they've bought access to a fleet of satellites around the Earth. And what they're doing is they're tracking things that change. So if your business wants to know how many cars are using this road, you can sign up to this service, and you can track with a live satellite the changes every day of traffic on a road. Or you can track building developments in another country, or you can track whatever you like, because Planet sees everything. This isn't open source, you have to pay for it, and it's privately owned. There's also, when it comes to Google and things, they used to worry about national security. The same would apply to Planet. What Google did in terms of national security is they would censor places of national interest. So they would censor nuclear power plants, and the White House roof, I haven't actually checked this, is all fuzzied out or something, so people don't know how to climb over it. People's houses don't get that same right, but or they will use out of date. Apparently in Washington, DC, the street view and the maps are a few years out of date, so it's never quite up to date. And in Australia, actually, back in 2005, this nuclear authority in Australia tried to sue Google on the grounds that it was going to cause a national security threat and tell people about the nuclear locations and how the plants were laid out and so on. And they actually lost this lawsuit. So that set a precedent, meaning that there's not really an issue with it. One thing that's interesting is some countries, so this is enough for some countries. Some countries will say, fine, censor this building and the president's house and we'll be okay with it. But Germany, for example, doesn't allow street view because they're very preoccupied with privacy and the rights of the individual and so on. But in Germany, you can still do 3D Google Maps. So while I can't go onto a street in Germany and look around at the houses that a car has taken a photo of, I can click the 3D button and Google's computers will have taken the satellite images and modeled what all of the buildings look like so that I can scroll around them. So in that way, using satellite data, it gets around it. And actually, there's privacy concerns about that. Germany have said, we don't want anyone to be able to go onto these streets digitally and look at people's houses. And using satellite data and technology, you can get around these things. There are questions to be asked. And it's a very complex, when it comes into the world of private versus international, it becomes a very complex situation. So there are levels of international cooperation in space. First of all, we've got, of course, the geostationary orbits matter, where that will be a point of contention. Countries have battled over them before, and what they have in terms of geostationary orbits, it's the International Telecommunications Union. And they, at the end of the day, they decide and they settle the case, and one country does it and another doesn't. But at the end of the day, only the countries that can afford to put satellites in space are able to have this argument in the first place. If the benefits of Earth observation are to be shared equally, and the countries that really need it are going to have access to it, then international cooperation is very important to make it so that it's not just in the hands of the richest countries and companies. In terms of weather data, in that sense, we have the Coordination Group for Meteorological Satellites, CGMS. What they meet every year, and they'll all get in a big room this year. It was online. They'll have their plenary, and representatives from every meteorological organization in the world will speak up and have a say. And they will, at these kind of conferences, they'll declare. So we'll have a representative from JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency and Weather Service. And they will say, we would like to put this satellite up next year. We're going to put it here. These are all of our plans of it. And now, under international recommendations, you're also meant to have a plan for how the satellite will come down at the end of its life. It's not enforced. You don't have to, but it's seen as good practice too. So they will also probably declare at the end of the satellite's life, we'll save enough fuel to shoot it into a graveyard orbit, which means an orbit where it's not going to bump into anything else. And then all of the other countries will listen, it will be written down in the minutes, and if they have an objection, they'll speak up and they'll say, but we wanted to put our satellite there. And it depends on cooperation. It depends on being able to have these conversations. But there is a forum to have those conversations. You can't enforce that certain countries won't put satellites in certain places or watch certain things. But with these kinds of unions, they have now, particularly for meteorology, set up channels of communication where before anything happens and before you're going to watch the weather, you need to check it with the other countries with whom you share space with. And before, in the past, so it was about 20 years ago, countries along the equator made a lawsuit where they tried to claim that the space directly above their country would be part of their territory. And then they could prevent others from, because that's hot property for geostationary satellites right around the equator, because you can see most things. And they could presumably charge rent for satellites over the equator or prevent countries from watching them. But it wasn't internationally recognized because there's no authority greater than the individual countries. And if people don't come to an agreement, then things remain open. Space was once no man's land, but now it's everyone's land. You have these forums for communication, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people try things and it was kind of forgotten because it's just not internationally recognized. What can you do? One of the best things, well, one of the motivations, is that with Earth observation, if it's done right, everyone benefits. So this is the reason that CGMS exists. This is the reason that countries don't shoot down each other's satellites and say, no, Russia's taking weather readings over Europe. They don't actually get into conflicts about this all too often. Because at the end of the day, particularly for weather and for the main things that Earth observation is used for, it's something that has value for everyone. When it comes to weather, clouds are on the scale of countries sometimes. Sometimes it feels like it's just cloudy over your town in particular. But if you look at these places like Windy, you can see that these are moving all the way around the Earth. And if Russia can tell you that it was cloudy there today, and this is the image of it, then you know it's coming here tomorrow. Extreme weather events are more than just a stormy day or random bad luck that can't be predicted. With weather services, you can see how hurricanes move across the ocean. You can give warnings to other countries and other countries can give warnings to you. This will save lives. It's proven to save lives. It's one of the best, weather satellites, one of the best returns on investment, they say, that you can do in space, because it will pay itself back in every extreme weather forecast event that you see coming, in every agricultural benefit you bring to your crops. It can make a difference and it will save you money in the long run. So again, another reason to collaborate internationally on where you put your satellites and sharing your weather data with each other. And in the future and in now, climate change is a major concern that's coming up. So climate change data is taken on the ground just like other weather data, you have different levels, you have ground, you have planes, and you have synoptic overall looking above the planet. And the synoptic data will track the way these storms are happening. We're predicting more storms to come with climate change and more extreme weather events that can't be predicted, like locust plagues. The reason the locust plagues came about this year is because more storms in the Indian Ocean brought more moisture than usual, trapped into a previously desert area. And then this moist desert area meant that more locusts could be born, and then that becomes exponential. So the benefits of climate change data will carry forward in ways that you don't even see coming sometimes, such as preventing future locust invasions. Here we'll just do a specific example for Earth observation in Africa. So EUMETSAT, for example, Europe's weather satellite agency, with the permission and the planning from the European Commission, share our satellite data with the African continent, and particularly with the African regional climate centres. So there'll be different climate centres in West Africa, East Africa, Central, South, and they will synoptically look after the predictions and send them out to the individual countries and governances and give advice and give predictions, warnings and so on. The reason for this is that the European weather data is coming down like this across the globe. It's going around the pole, particularly the METOP satellites. So it sees Europe and then Africa's underneath, so it sees Africa as well. And we have this data anyway. And African space industry is in its infancy. It's coming on, there are plans and ideas, but there aren't really any African weather satellites out there. And it's one of the most vulnerable, you've got some of the most vulnerable communities in the Earth there. You've got people who are farming day to day, who are farming for their communities, and who in extreme kind of climate situations in deserts with seasonal rains and so on, have the most benefit to gain from weather predictions and from agricultural predictions and for forecasting of insects and so on. So Europe share this weather satellite data with Africa. And one of the ways this was enabled was it helped with the locust tracking earlier this year. So our data would go to the regional climate centres, the regional climate centres would process it, they would gather the information, they'd make their forecast on where the locusts are going to go. They then go to the governments and decision makers in the countries that are going to be affected, and they present what the predictions are, and then they will act on those predictions by sending out trucks with pesticides, or by sending out planes with pesticides, or even people on the ground and waiting there and looking for where the locusts are going to come. So this, in my opinion, this is a great example of the benefits of international cooperation in Earth observation. Earth observation doesn't shine when it's each country for themselves or each company for themselves, when it's locked away behind a paywall or for a corporation or a country only looking at themselves and not sharing their data, because the benefits, you're observing the whole Earth. You see everything on the ground to the degree of a few meters, and the best way to justify this invasion of privacy of other countries is to keep it open source and to bring the benefits to everyone, particularly the people who need it the most. This is where Earth observation shines. This is a great example of the importance of international cooperation in making this possible. What use is a satellite if people can't access the data? What use is a satellite as an experiment in thought and in science on its own without bringing a difference to the people? This is the example of international cooperation and geopolitics in the world of Earth observation. And then we look at future prospects for Earth observation. We see that it's dependent on funding on an international agreement. It's not guaranteed. Satellites will have a life expectancy of 10 or 20 years. We've got the new meteosats going up now, but countries need to decide that it's a priority to fund Earth observation. Particularly, it is becoming a priority. Things like climate change, there's a lot of funding in this now. But if it doesn't happen, we lose the ability that we've only had it for 50 years, the ability to see the clouds and to track the weather from above. But we take it for granted now, and if we lose it, if we don't have those satellites up anymore, then we lose the ability to respond to a lot of things. It's important to be open source, because if we lose the governmental capacity to observe the Earth, then it becomes something that you can sell for profit, which will affect the ability of countries to respond to climate change, and it reduces the accountability on an international scale for countries observing other countries. While it makes it complicated, it is important that we have those avenues to communicate between governments over who sees what and whether they're comfortable with them doing it. Spying satellites are out of the decision here. I don't think anyone is reporting on those, for better or for worse. We've got international regulations, channels, we've got channels of communication such as CGMS, but also having laws in place would be very good for the benefit of Earth observation. A lot of laws regarding space are very outdated now. They were established first in the 1960s when the first satellites were going up, and now there's hundreds and thousands of things up there, including a lot of dead things. And the dynamic and the shape of space and the industry has changed a lot. We need more international regulations, such as the one that tells countries to have a plan for how their satellites go out of orbit. Making things like that compulsory will reduce the amount of space debris in orbit and hopefully in the future prevent Kessler syndrome situations where we'll lose crucial Earth observation capacity, because it will be important. Earth observation for climate change and for weather is going to be one of the most valuable things we have in space. It's going to be ever more important. And that's about it for my talk on geopolitics and Earth observation. I hope you have more of an idea about who is watching us from the sky and how the things that happen in space make a difference to the lives of people on Earth, and how the lives of people on Earth and the decisions we make on the ground can make a difference to where things go in space and to what things we can be allowed to do. A lot of the things we've benefited from, particularly in the last 50 years in terms of Earth observation, have been dependent on good channels of communication between countries and a mutual understanding of the importance of Earth observation. I think if relations were to worsen between countries, we might see our ability to predict the weather and things worsen as a result. So we should never take things for granted and think more about the international context for our science. Thank you very much.